In a free nation, therefore, reason is in truth realized. It is a present living spirit in which the individual not only finds his essential character, that is, his universal and particular nature, expressed and present to him in the form of thinghood, but is himself this essence, and also has realized that essential character. The wisest men of antiquity have therefore declared that wisdom and virtue consist in living in accordance with the customs of one's own nation. Paragraph 352 is building off of this idea that Hegel has introduced just earlier of ethical substance. Here he's going to talk in terms of a free nation, a freie Volk. You don't necessarily have to think in terms of a nation state, but rather any sort of ethnic grouping, any sort of community that isn't necessarily defined in terms of its genetics, although it often will turn out to be the case for that, but rather in terms of having some sort of system of norms in place that are at least acknowledged. They're going to be violated by some of the people, but norms are in fact acknowledged by the punishment of the violation, or the ways in which people have to compromise in order to reconcile the violation of them. But these norms, laws, and customs, as he's talked about in the previous passages, here he's just going to talk about customs, Sitte, but laws are already being sort of built into that. This is the way in which reason, he says, is realized, is made real, is made effective, as he says, in truth, in Wahrheit. Now that's very important, because we have this motion or movement that's occurring continuously in the phenomenology, going from certainty, something that's being grasped, something that's immediate, to trying to grasp the truth of it, and in the process of trying to assure ourselves of the truth rather than just merely the certainty, we often end up losing the certainty, going through this process of alienation, and then we have to recuperate it or reconcile it, or have some sort of way of bringing things back together and integrating them, however you want to conceive of it. So Hegel's starting off here in 352 talking about the beginning of a process which at first seems quite harmonious, like everything has come together and we have a nice, seemingly static state where everything has been reconciled, everything's worked out. It's not going to remain like that very long. So what we're doing here is setting out the launching pad, you might say. And he talks about the individual and the nation as being connected together in, he says, a present living spirit. The individual not only finds his essential character, that is, as Hegel says, his universal and his particular nature expressed and present to him in the form of thinghood, in the form of a thing, in the form of something objective, something that he can see, something that he can understand about himself. He finds that in the nation, in this gathering, in this grouping that the person belongs to, that they probably didn't have any choice about joining originally. And he goes on and he says, it is himself this essence, the essence, and he's realized the essential character. The nation is providing the essence for the individual. And so Hegel then talks about the wisest sages of antiquity counseling that the laws and customs of one's nation, to follow those is indeed the height of wisdom, of Weisheit, and virtue, Tugend. These two sort of correlative terms, understanding and behaving correctly, doing things correctly, being the right way. And Hegel's not actually endorsing this as a kind of cultural relativism or an unthinking acceptance of the norms, the laws, the customs of one's own nation or location or anything like that. But he is saying that this is something that is an important step along the way. But from this happy state of having realized its essential character and of living in it, self-consciousness, which at first is spirit only immediately and in principle, has withdrawn, or else has not yet realized it. For both may equally well be said. In paragraph 353, we have the beginning of a process of alienation of the individual self-consciousness from the society, from the group, from the folk that we've been talking about so far. It can be translated also as nation, if we like. And Hegel begins by talking about this happy state that we just saw, mentioned in the previous paragraph. This is what we're going to be trying to get back to for a long time as we go through the phenomenology, and sometimes thinking that we've got it, but then finding out, no, it slips between our fingers. And this is a case in which there is kind of a, you might say, coincidence, but not simply an identity, but a dynamic relationship between the individual, self-conscious individual, the reasoner, and the ethical substance of the society. This is the unity of spirit. And Hegel says that what's going on in this happy state is that the individual has realized their essential character, and even more than that, they are living in that essential character. And this is something he's going to talk in later passages. Here he mentions happiness, but happiness itself is going to become an object that is going to be pursued because of this, you might say, sort of nostalgia for this happy state. And we have an alienation here. Why? Because as Hegel points out, the individual, the self-consciousness, isn't really spirit in a full way, nor in their seeming unity with their society and its ways of understanding the rest of the world, including itself. It's only implicitly and in principle, or nach Begriff, after the concept, spirit. It's not yet spirit. So what is separating it from spirit? The fact that self-consciousness itself has, as he says, withdrawn, or it literally is withdrawn, although that's the way of using this kind of verb in the past tense. Ausgetreten, it's walked out, right? Or it has not yet realized this essential character. Nicht noch erreicht. It is not yet brought to fulfillment, that character in itself. And so here we are seeing the beginning of a long process of moving away from the ethical substance, which is always going to involve a desire to be reunited with it. Reason must withdraw from this happy state, for the life of a free people is only in principle or immediately the reality of an ethical order. In other words, the ethical order exists merely as something given. Therefore, this universal spirit itself is a separate individual spirit, and the customs and laws in their entirety are a specific ethical substance which only in the higher stage, that is, in spirit's consciousness of its essence, sheds this limitation, and in this knowledge alone has its absolute truth, not directly as it immediately is. In the latter form, it is a limited ethical substance, and absolute limitation is just this, that spirit is in the form of mere being. It's very important here in paragraph 354 to be able to see what Hegel's criticism, if you like, of the ethical substance, the sittliche Substanz, truly is, and not to mix it up with something else, like, say, a complaint about relativism or something along those lines. Although that is going to play, you might say, a limited part in practice in where he's going with this. So what we're interested in is the domain of universal spirit, right? And we thought that we found this in the life of the free people. And by participating in that life, perhaps through, fulfilling one's social roles, or by, working for one's own good and thereby working for the good of the other, by following the norms, or even, reinterpreting the norms, all that sort of stuff, one was able to have this relationship of a harmonious coexistence as part of the greater whole. The individual and what exceeds the individual, what transcends the individual, were thereby integrated. But we saw that starts to fall apart. And why is that the case? Well, when we think about what he's calling the life of the free people, the folk, right? He calls this, as what Miller's translating here, something given, something that is, you might say, just taken for granted. The word that he uses here is not given, like, gegeben, or anything like that. It's seiende, but we've seen that when something is a sein, or just, etwas, or eines seiende, something that happens to be, it seems as if it lacks a certain necessity. It seems rather arbitrary. And so if you think about norms and the way that they work, laws and customs, I say, well, why do we do things this way? Oh, well, that's just the way we happen to do it. Or there may be some sort of determination that takes place at some point, but after a while it comes to seem like, well, it could have happened differently. We just are following along with this. We're reacting, say, to environmental conditions, or some guy liked this particular aesthetic and we just stuck with it. You can have all sorts of examples. So something given. And Hegel talks about this, and here's where we're getting to the real meat of it. He talks about this as being what again, Miller's translating, and rightly so, as specific ethical substance. Now, the German for this is bestimmte sittliche Substanz. No problem with the sittliche, the ethical, right? Bestimmte. Another way of translating this is determined or determinate. So insofar as it has been determined in a particular way, say, let's take, for example, eating certain foods and not eating other foods. And there may be all sorts of reasons why, one shouldn't eat this kind of food in this sort of environment, and, all sorts of things along those lines. Or there might be reasons that have to do with the aesthetics of taste or anything like that. But insofar as it is bestimmte, insofar as it's determined, insofar as it's specific, it is leaving some things out, it's excluding them. It's in a certain way not quite universal. But this is the sort of tragedy. In order to try to be universal, you've got to determine some things, and yet if you determine them, then you wind up being limited. And the word that's translated here as limited is really quite interesting. Beschränkte, right? Hegel could have said, he could have talked in terms of borders or Grenze, right? That would be a more neutral term, but beschränkte has this connotation, at least to my ears, of being kind of closed in on itself. Not yet claustrophobic, but certainly, we say, a little parochial, a little, closed off. And what Hegel's saying is, this is what the life of the free people really is like. Why is that a problem? He says, this universal spirit itself is a separate individual spirit. And the customs and laws in their entirety are a specific ethical substance, which only in the higher stage in spirit's consciousness of its essence sheds this limitation. And in this knowledge alone has its absolute truth. That's what it's driving after in the life of a specific, great, living, wonderful people. There's a kind of restrictedness to it, and it's not embodying this higher stage, the absolute truth, which is a possibility for it. There's something thereby lacking to it. Even though it seems to be a plenitude, it's lacking. So he goes on and he says, what we realize is it's a limited ethical substance. And absolute limitation is just this, that spirit is in the form of a mere being. Again, we have the eines seiendes, right? Spirit has been reduced to something that merely is. I'm a Frenchman. I'm a ancient Greek from Athens. I am a Hegel scholar, and part of a community perhaps, right? Although a rather attenuated one. What is the issue here? Notice what he's not saying. Hegel is not saying, well, this is limited, and we could have thought about it a whole bunch of other different ways, and there's a whole bunch of other communities, and they see things different ways. So this can't be the ethical substance because, why do they get to claim to be that when the other ones could have just as good of a claim? He's not saying that at this point. What he is saying is something about the nature of determination in general when it comes to ethical substance. And he's also got the individual in the background of this universal spirit. Further, therefore, the single individual consciousness as it exists immediately in the real ethical order or in the nation is a solid, unshaken trust in which spirit has not, for the individual, resolved itself into its abstract moments, and therefore he is not aware of himself as being a pure individuality on his own account. But once he has arrived at this idea, as he must, then this immediate unity with spirit, the mere being of himself in spirit, his trust, is lost. Isolated and on his own, it is he who is now the essence, no longer in the universal spirit. This individuality of self-consciousness is, it is true, a moment in universal spirit itself, but only as a vanishing quantity, which, appearing on its own, is at once resolved within universal spirit and enters consciousness merely as trust. In thus establishing himself, and each moment, because it is a moment of the essence, must succeed in exhibiting itself as the essence, the individual has thereby placed himself in opposition to the laws and customs. These are regarded as mere ideas, having no absolute essentiality, an abstract theory without any reality, while he, as this particular I, is his own living truth. What may have seemed quite abstract in the previous paragraphs, now in paragraph 355 becomes very concrete, very easy to visualize, because there's a stark opposition that we're going to be looking at, one between the individual and the society, along with its norms, its customs, its laws. This is a very important transition point for our movement into the sections that follow, the real meat of this particular portion of the reason section. So Hegel says, the single individual consciousness as it exists immediately in the real ethical order or the nation, right, the folk, when that is going on, when it's still in that happy state, everything is nice, everything is wonderful, there's this interplay between the two. But what we don't have there is a pure individuality, an Einzelnheit, right? There's no Einzeln. There's no individuality. The individual is, you might say, sort of submerged. It's not as if they don't have agency or the capacity to say I at all or to take responsibility, but they're doing so in a restricted way. We talk about people not really knowing who they are, figured out who they are, and needing to go find themselves. This is part part of what Hegel is discussing here. So he says, it exists in a solid, unshaken trust in which spirit has not, for the individual, resolved itself into its abstract moments. Therefore, he's not aware of himself as being a pure individuality on his own account. Doesn't mean, again, like I said, that he's not aware of himself as an individuality, but he's not aware just what individuality means, which is the capacity to, you might say, take responsibility for oneself, to stand against the norms, which is what's going to happen next. So he goes on and he says, once he has arrived at this idea, as he must. Now notice that key term, as he must. What is Hegel saying here? This is something that we see happen in the life of so many people. They begin, and sometimes it happens in adolescence or early adulthood. Sometimes it only happens much, much later. Somebody's been a company person, and they worked for the benefit of the company this whole time, thinking that the company was going to reward them and take account of what a great guy or great gal they are, and suddenly they realize, no, that's not the way it actually is. I'm being taken advantage of. I've got to look out for myself. What about my retirement? What about the meaning of my own existence? I should start sending my resume. These things happen in very concrete ways. It's not always somebody being involved in a Greek tragedy that this has to happen in. It can happen in a multitude of ways. But Hegel goes on and he says, this immediate unity with the spirit, the mere being of himself in spirit, his trust, this vertrauen is a word that he uses several times in this passage. This trust is now lost. What does that mean? Notice how Hegel then sketches things out. Isolated, on his own. In German is actually isoliert, right? It is he who is now the essence. The individual now becomes the essential. Or if we want to be very literal about this, as Miller is here, the individual becomes the essence, the Wesen, the being that has importance, the being that is not just a being, but the being around which the other beings center, the being that other beings constellate around. What about universal spirit? Well, universal spirit, understood as the community and understood as its norms, is no longer the essential. This is a radical change. This is a shock. When you come to realize that what you have been taken as sort of the moral world around you no longer operates the way that you think it does, when the veil is pulled back, when the masks are torn off, there's a moment of shock, or perhaps sometimes even a lifetime of shock for some people. Sometimes people never snap out of it. And you realize, oh, I could do anything and it might be okay, because I'm bringing myself around with me. I don't have to actually bring those laws and norms around with me. I can decide whether I'm going to accept them or not. This is actually sort of an existentialist moment here in Hegel, right? So if you ever read a Kierkegaardian critique or Sartrean critique, well, there's some Hegel that's like that. So he goes on and he says, this individuality of self-consciousness is, it is true, a moment in universal spirit itself, but only as a vanishing quantity, which appearing on its own is at once resolved within universal spirit and enters consciousness merely as trust. So universal spirit is being sort of rejected. It's not that universal spirit in a broader sense isn't there, but the relationship that the individual is able to have with it is only one of trust. And that trust must become something different than the trust that was over here. There is no trust anymore over here, right? That's been lost. What does the individual have? What does the individual want? He says, in establishing itself, and each moment, because it is a moment of the essence, must succeed in exhibiting itself as the essence, the individual has placed himself in opposition to the laws and the customs, to the universal spirit that was what was going on here in the ethical order. The individual says, I may not follow the laws. I have to decide whether the laws and customs actually work for me, and I'm the essential one because I'm the one who actually gets to make that determination for myself. Now, this places them in a somewhat compromising and compromised position, but it's one that's going to be quite important for the development of the individual. He says, they realize that the laws and customs are mere ideas, having no absolute essentiality. In the past, they could look at those laws and customs as, well, that's just what everyone does. Of course I'm going to do that, because I'm that kind of person. I belong. Afterwards, after this awareness, this, becoming awakened or having one's eyes opened, so well, wait a second. Those don't compel me. Some people follow them, other people don't. I have to decide which one I'm going to be. And the mere fact that some people think I ought to behave that way, or mom and dad said that, or some, book or some elders go around preaching about that, doesn't mean that I have to do it. This is a very important moment. So he says, they're regarded as mere ideas, an abstract theory without any reality. But the individual, as the particular I, is, as Hegel says, his own living truth. So instead of mere trust, the individual feels him or herself to be the truth, and they are now going to try to work that out. It's one thing to feel it, it's another thing to think it, it's another thing to think it through.